Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Oklahoma Territory. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the early months of 1881, the territory that would later become Oklahoma was still wild, largely unsettled and contested. The land we now call Central Oklahoma lay just on the fringe of the unassigned lands, territory that the U.S. government had only recently begun considering for non-native settlement. Histories of those unassigned lands show how the U.S. government gradually opened them for claim by settlers in the late 1880s. Wikipedia. A small, dusty settlement known to locals as Dry Fork Crossing had sprung up near a creek crossing. It consisted of a few wooden dwellings, a general store, and most relevant to our tale, a modest saloon built by two women who called themselves the Hartley sisters, Matilda Hartley and Louisa Hartley. Though saloons in frontier territories were not uncommon, theirs had already drawn whispered remarks for its melancholic look, darkened windows, silent hours, odd flickers of lanterns. On the evening of April 12, 1881, under a low amber sky, a stagecoach rattled into Dry Fork Crossing. Its driver, one Elijah Boone, described the air as heavy, as if the land moaned under the wind. He stopped at the saloon, seeking a drink and to rest. Inside he found the place nearly empty. Only one of the Hartley sisters, Matilda, stood behind the bar polishing a glass. Her face was pale, her hands steady. She offered no greeting, Boone recalled later. I never heard a laugh. The air smelled faintly of whiskey and something stale, like a damp earth after rain. He paused, brushed his hat back, and left quickly. At the time, he thought nothing more of it. But for the people nearby, it marked the first flicker of curiosity. That same night, Jens Ellison, a ranch hand living just outside the settlement, claimed to have heard muffled sobs coming from the saloon's direction, though he could not make out words. He crept closer, heart pounding, but saw no light in the back rooms. Nothing but the silent, shuttered windows stared back. Over the next weeks, more travelers passing through Dry Fork Crossing made note of the saloon's odd hours. Sometimes it was locked up midday. Sometimes a light glowed faintly at 2 a.m. Sometimes, walking past, they swore they felt footsteps inside when the building was supposed to be closed. But no one dared confront the sisters, for there was no local constable nearby. The region was loosely policed by federal marshals, who rarely ventured so far into fringe settlements. Meanwhile, in county ledger books held in the nearest county seat, some 25 miles distant, property records show that Matilda and Louisa Hartley had secured a dubious claim to the land under the name Hartley and Cubbins Saloons. Their paperwork was thin, their signatures shaky, and the clerks later noted uncertainty in grant beside their name. The sisters had no known family lineage in those parts. Neighbors remembered a traveling wagon passing before their arrival, then a single wagon departing months later, leaving them as the odd permanent fixture. In quiet moments, local women whispered among themselves, why would two unmarried women open a saloon in such harsh territory? Some speculated they were widows trying to survive. Others believed darker rumors of ill deeds in distant towns following them like shadows. Thus, in the first months of 1881, Dry Fork Crossing Saloon, managed by the Hartley sisters, became an uneasy focal point. The land around it, at the edge of the unassigned lands, was itself a contested ground in the wider story of settlement and expansion. Recall that the U.S. government's resort to opening those unassigned lands would become a major issue in the decade ahead. Wikipedia. But what began as whispers and oddities would soon escalate. And so we turn to the first disappearances, where silence breaks and the ground yields secrets. 1881 Oklahoma Territory, Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the Bloodied bottles. By the summer of 1881, Dry Fork Crossing sweltered beneath a relentless heat. Dust clung to every window, and flies gathered thick around the horses tethered outside the saloon. Yet despite the weather, something colder had taken root in the settlement's mood. A young drover named Amos Dyer, only 21, was the first to vanish. He had been driving cattle through the western edge of the unassigned lands, returning from Fort Reno with two companions. According to those men, he lingered behind at the saloon for just one drink while the others camped by the creek. He never returned. The next morning his horse was found tied behind the saloon, unsaddled, water bucket full, reins intact. The Hartley sisters told the men that Amos had left late, walking east toward the trading post. Their words were calm, but something in their stillness unsettled the men. One of them, Ezekiel Pike, would later testify to a marshal's deputy that Louisa Hartley's apron had been damp and reddish at the hem, though she claimed it was wine spilled while cleaning bottles. Rumors swelled like a storm. The settlement's itinerant preacher, Reverend Callum Hayes, delivered a sermon warning against the devil's drink houses springing up along the frontier. Some said he meant the Hartley Saloon in particular. He wrote in his personal journal, preserved years later in church archives, "There is an unwholesome air about that place. Two women, too quiet, too polite, too fixed upon their craft. I sense rot beneath the oak boards." Around this same period, territorial newspapers began carrying dispatches about mysterious disappearances among cattle drivers and drifters along the road connecting Fort Reno to Purcell. In one column, a brief mention appeared about a lonely establishment operated by sisters in the vicinity of the unassigned lands, one of the earliest recorded notices of what Dry Fork Crossing would become infamous for. By late August, settlers reported strange odors rising from the creek behind the saloon. A hunter named Eli Vaughn claimed he found a patch of earth disturbed, freshly turned but poorly covered. When he brought it up at the general store, the clerk dismissed it as a buried animal carcass. Vaughn, however, later wrote in his letter to a cousin, "That ground wasn't dug for no beast. It was too square, too clean, and I swear the soil was darker than it ought to be." Still, no one dared act. The nearest U.S. Marshal was nearly 3 days' ride away, and the local settlers preferred not to stir trouble. In those years, the territory was a liminal place, neither state nor fully governed land. As the Unassigned Lands article reminds us, law enforcement was scattered, and settlers often relied on vigilantes or self-styled committees to maintain order. By autumn, 2 more travelers were gone, a tinker named Paul Drury and a card dealer known only as Red Jack. Both were last seen drinking at the Wicked Saloon. In her later recollection, a local midwife, Mrs. Ada Connolly, described the sisters visiting her home late one evening to purchase laudanum. Louisa told her they needed it for the nerves, claiming Matilda had trouble sleeping. Connolly noted the smell of damp wood and iron clinging to their shawls. Within weeks, unease became dread. Travelers began avoiding the route entirely. Only the most desperate still passed through. And then, one cold morning in early November, a rancher's dog dragged home what appeared to be a human bone. The rancher's name was Samuel Keaton, a veteran of the Union Army who had settled near Dry Fork Crossing after the war. On that gray November morning, his hound Jasper returned from the creek with something clenched between its teeth. At first, Samuel thought it was a deer bone, but when he lifted it into the light, he froze. The curve, the length, it was unmistakably human. Keaton wrapped the bone in burlap and rode to the settlement, showing it first to Eli Vaughn, the hunter who'd spoken months earlier about the disturbed earth. Together they brought it to the saloon. Matilda Hartley stood in the doorway as they approached, face unreadable. Vaughn later told a deputy she didn't blink when she saw it, just said plenty of coyotes around here, then shut the door right in our faces. That same afternoon, a handful of townsfolk gathered near the creek. With shovels and lanterns, they began to dig. The soil was wet, heavy, and smelled faintly of spirits, whiskey mixed with something fouler. By dusk, they uncovered what appeared to be the remains of at least 2 men, their boots still intact, pockets empty. No one slept that night. Word spread fast. Dry Fork Crossing was suddenly a town on edge. The following morning, Reverend Hayes rode to Fort Reno to alert the authorities, while the remaining settlers locked their doors and shuttered windows. 2 days later, Deputy Marshal William Latham arrived with 3 men. His report, preserved in fragments within territorial archives, described the Hartley sisters as composed but uncooperative. He wrote, when questioned, they denied all involvement, claiming the creek served as a dumping ground for transients who met misfortune along the road. Louisa Hartley spoke softly, with a tremor not of fear but fatigue. Matilda watched me the whole time, her eyes pale as old milk. The deputy searched the saloon. Beneath a trapdoor in the storage cellar, he found a narrow pit containing broken glass bottles, burned fabric scraps, and something else, a rusted tin ledger half charred by fire. Though mostly unreadable, several entries were visible: initials, dates, and crude sums of money. One entry stood out: AD $6 whiskey repairs silence. The townsfolk speculated it referred to Amos Dyer, the missing drover. But before the deputy could pursue it further, a sudden rainstorm flooded the area, and his team was forced to retreat back to Fort Reno. They promised to return, but by the time they did, 10 days later, the sisters and their saloon were gone. The building had been burned to its foundation. Charred wood still smoked faintly, and the air reeked of pitch and ashes. No bodies were found, no wagon tracks leading away, only the cracked signboard reading Hartley and Counders half buried in mud. Witnesses would later disagree about who set the blaze. Some said they saw figures leaving town under cover of night. Others swore the fire began from within, an accident of spilled oil and lanterns. Years later, territorial historians examining records of the unassigned lands era noted how such disappearances often went unrecorded due to lack of jurisdiction. Lawlessness, open claims, and shifting borders created the perfect veil for crimes that left no resolution. The Hartley case became one of those haunting footnotes, part of the same unsettled history described in contemporary sources about Oklahoma's early settlements. Yet even after the fire, strange reports persisted. Keaton's ranch hands spoke of lantern lights flickering by the creek long after the saloon's ruin cooled. And sometimes, when the wind carried just right, folks claimed they could hear faint laughter. Two women laughing low somewhere in the dark. 1881, Oklahoma Territory. Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles. By the turn of 1882, Dry Fork Crossing was nearly deserted. The burned saloon sat like a wound upon the land, its blackened timbers jutting upward like broken ribs. What had once been a place of loud talk and whiskey fumes was now just silence and wind. The deputy marshal's follow-up report mentioned that no trace of Matilda or Louisa Hartley has been found. Possible aliases suspected. But there were hints, small and unsettling. A rancher in the northern section of the territory reported seeing two women traveling by wagon, one with a bandaged hand, both dressed as widows. When questioned, he could not describe their faces clearly, only that they kept their heads low and their voices softer than a prayer. Meanwhile, Reverend Hayes returned from Fort Reno changed. His sermons grew darker, focused on guilt, decay, and retribution. In one surviving pamphlet printed in 1883, he wrote, "There are evils not of the devil, but of human design, born of loneliness and liquor. The earth may cover their deeds, but it will never silence them." For months after the fire, scavengers avoided the saloon's ruins. Yet one man, Tom Carver, a prospector passing through, ignored the warnings. Hoping to recover any valuables, he dug through the ashes in March 1882. He later told others he found something strange: several unbroken bottles sealed with wax, their contents dark and cloudy. When he opened one, the liquid inside was thick and sour. Floating within, he claimed, was a lock of hair. Carver disposed of the bottles immediately, burying them near the creek, and swore never to return. His account was dismissed as drunken fancy, but years later, children playing near the same site unearthed fragments of those wax-sealed bottles, their corks blackened but still intact. The Weekly Territorial Gazette ran a short piece that summer titled "The Wicked Saloon Mystery." It summarized the events briefly: 2 women proprietors, missing men, an unexplained fire, and noted that no remains of the sisters were ever recovered. The editor referenced how such mysteries were symptomatic of the disorder in the unassigned lands echoing commentary found in early reports about the area's ungoverned settlements and the desperate characters they attracted. A retired Army surgeon, Dr. Nathaniel Bowers, who had briefly served at Fort Reno, visited the remains later that same year. He examined the pit found beneath the saloon and concluded that some of the burned debris showed traces of fat and calcium consistent with cremated remains. His notes, archived decades later at the Oklahoma Historical Society, were never officially entered into any court record, yet they provided one of the few analytical voices amid the growing folklore. Even so, the story began to drift beyond fact. Campfire tales spread about the bloodied bottles, said to contain the souls of the men who drank there. Cowhands passing through claimed to see shapes by the creek at night, two figures in dark shawls, silently watching from the reeds. It was during this period that the name Wicked Saloon first appeared in oral accounts. Settlers from neighboring homesteads used it as shorthand for the cursed ruins, warning newcomers to steer clear. By 1884, Dry Fork Crossing was struck from most mail routes, leaving only a handful of stubborn farmers behind. But history, as it often does, refused to stay buried. In 1887, during the surveying of land claims preceding the land run, a federal cartographer stumbled upon the charred foundation again. What he found beneath it reignited the legend and turned the Wicked Saloon from rumor into record. The surveyor's name was Charles Dent, a 32-year-old draftsman assigned to chart boundaries in preparation for the coming land, openings of the unassigned lands, according to the notes preserved in his field journal, now stored in the Oklahoma Territorial Archives. Dent arrived at the ruins of Dry Fork Crossing on August 3, 1887. The charred saloon sat on a gentle slope by the creek, half reclaimed by grass and wild sumac. Dent's team was marking water sources when one of his assistants struck metal beneath the soil. They unearthed what appeared to be an iron-bound crate, rusted shut. Dent, curious and believing it might contain valuables, pried it open. Inside were glass bottles, about a dozen, arranged neatly, each sealed with wax. Some were cracked, others still whole. The fluid inside had turned dark and viscous, with strange sediment settled at the bottom. Dent's assistant, a young man named Howard Bell, wrote later in his own account, "When the sunlight hit them, the bottles glimmered red like lanterns in fog. Mr. Dent wanted to record their position, but the smell from within was foul, like vinegar and rot. He decided to bury them again and mark the coordinates for the official ledger. However, curiosity lingered. That evening, Dent carried one bottle back to his tent and placed it near the campfire. He noticed faint streaks on the glass, scratches resembling initials, LH. The next morning, the bottle was gone. Bell swore he hadn't touched it. Dent, disturbed but unwilling to admit superstition, pressed onward with his survey and left the remaining bottles buried. Weeks later, when Dent's maps reached the General Land Office, a clerk appended a small note beside the Dry Fork area, site of destroyed structure, unverified criminal past. That small annotation would later fuel a wave of local folklore, conflating Dent's discovery with tales of witchcraft and poisoned whiskey. Meanwhile, in the nearby town of El Reno, an aging lawman named Deputy Latham, the same who had once investigated the Hartley sisters, heard of Dent's find. In a letter dated October 1887, he wrote to a colleague, "I thought the earth had buried their sins, but it seems the soil refuses to keep quiet. If any trace remains, it'll be in those cursed bottles." He attempted to retrieve the crate, but found the survey site deserted. Heavy rains that season flooded the creek and erased the markers. Only a fragment of Dent's original sketch survived, showing a faint outline of the ruined saloon and the cryptic words, "Red glass below, don't disturb." By the end of that decade, as settlers flooded into the Oklahoma Territory following the land run of 1889, few remembered the sisters' names. New towns rose over the same soil, fences crossed forgotten graves, and Dry Fork Crossing disappeared from maps entirely. Yet among early homesteaders, stories persisted, of crops failing near the old saloon's footprint, of animals refusing to drink from the creek, of travelers who camped there waking to the sound of bottles clinking softly, as if moved by unseen hands. Historians reviewing Dent's journal years later would reference these entries when examining the darker folklore of settlement life, connecting them to the broader transformations described in the Unassigned Lands article. The expansion of law and settlement often buried mysteries rather than solved them, and in the case of the Hartley sisters, the truth seemed destined to sink beneath both time and superstition. Still, one final entry in Dent's log, dated October 29, 1887, would ensure the Wicked Saloon's legend never fully died. It read simply, "Heard laughter near camp last night. 2 voices, both women. Thought it was the wind until the fire dimmed and the bottles rattled. 1881, Oklahoma Territory, Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles." When Charles Dent's field notes surfaced decades later, scholars would debate their authenticity. But to those who lived nearest to the site, there was little doubt that something sinister lingered at Dry Fork Creek. In early 1888, a group of settlers from Kansas, among them Joseph and Martha Binns, arrived to homestead near the ruins. They built a simple two-room cabin, clearing brush where the saloon had once stood. In letters to her sister, Martha described how at night the air around the creek seemed thicker than elsewhere, and how the wind sometimes carries the smell of wet oak and old whiskey. For a few weeks, life was quiet. Then the livestock began to sicken. Chickens refused to roost in their pens, and the family's mule bolted one night never to return. When Joseph dug a small drainage ditch behind the cabin, his spade struck glass, again one of the wax-sealed bottles. He broke it accidentally, and the stench that poured out made him reel. The liquid inside had congealed into a dark jelly streaked with white. Martha wrote in her February 1888 letter, "Joseph burned the fragment straight away, but I swear to you, the air seemed to cry out. For 3 nights we heard knocking on the back wall, soft like someone rapping from inside." By spring they had abandoned the property entirely, leaving behind their tools and furniture. The neighbors who found the cabin months later reported the wood warped and discolored, as though water had seeped through, but there had been no rain for weeks. Around the same time, reports reached Fort Reno of a pair of women fitting the Hartley sisters' descriptions. One informant, a male coach driver, claimed they were operating a small boarding house under new names, Mrs. Larkin and Miss Howell, on the northern edge of Indian Territory. The local marshal, skeptical, sent a deputy to investigate, but by the time he arrived, the house had been vacated. A witness recalled 2 women departing at dawn, one wearing gloves despite the heat, the other carrying a small wooden case that clinked softly as she walked. Later analysis of correspondence from that period, especially from the Fort Reno records and settlers' diaries, suggests that local officials hesitated to pursue the sisters too closely. The territory was unstable, jurisdictional lines blurred. As outlined in the unassigned lands reference, the overlapping claims between federal and tribal authorities left wide gaps in law enforcement, allowing fugitives to vanish into anonymity. Folklore soon merged with fact. By 1890, the wicked saloon had entered popular storytelling along cattle trails, told in low tones beside campfires. The tale shifted with each retelling. Some claimed the sisters were ghosts. Others said they were still alive, moving from town to town, poisoning drifters for gold teeth and trinkets. But beneath the exaggerations, fragments of truth persisted. One fragment came from an affidavit discovered years later by a historian named Eleanor Fitch, who was cataloguing pre-statehood records in 1902. The affidavit, unsigned, dated April 1888, described a sighting of 2 women digging by lantern light near the Dry Fork ruins. The witness, who remained unnamed, claimed to have followed them from a distance and heard clinking glass, and one of them saying, "We must take what's left before the land changes." The next morning, the site was empty once again. If true, this would have been among the last recorded moments the Hartley sisters were seen alive. 1881 Oklahoma Territory, Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles. In the years that followed, the Oklahoma Territory shifted rapidly toward formal governance. Rail lines expanded, towns were incorporated, and the chaos of the early settlement period slowly gave way to order. But the story of the Hartley sisters remained like a shadow cast across those new beginnings. By 1891, a regional journalist named Clifton Harrow from the El Reno Ledger began collecting accounts of early frontier crimes. Among his papers, later preserved in the Oklahoma Historical Society, he dedicated a section titled "The Blood at Dry Fork." Harrow's tone was investigative, but restrained. He cited first-hand interviews with settlers who had known the sisters and drew upon reports from Marshall's archives, what few existed. In one passage, he paraphrased a statement from Deputy William Latham, now retired. "They weren't mad, those women. They were deliberate. Each move thought out. If not for the rains that year, I'd have taken them in." Harrow noted how several bottles recovered near the site were sent to Fort Reno's medical office for examination. The results, as he described, were inconclusive but unsettling. Trace compounds resembling strychnine and arsenic were detected. Whether these were remnants of crude liquor distillation or deliberate poisoning could not be determined. This discovery reignited public fascination. Suddenly, the tale of the wicked saloon was no longer folklore. It became a cautionary emblem of lawlessness before statehood. The story circulated in pamphlets, traveling shows, and even dime novels. Yet for all the embellishment, Harrow's meticulous references to real witnesses and surviving documents lent the case a strange credibility. Midway through his reporting, Harrow mentioned the federal surveys of the unassigned lands, a detail drawn directly from contemporary records. He speculated that the sisters might have chosen their location precisely because it lay within disputed boundaries, exploiting the absence of legal oversight. The official unassigned lands history corroborates that such gaps allowed settlers, traders, and even fugitives to move undetected across borders until well into the 1890s. Around this same time, other oddities emerged. A homesteader clearing brush near the old Dry Fork Trail uncovered a half-buried trunk containing torn fabric and a small ivory-handled razor. Etched faintly on the handle were the letters MH. He turned it over to local authorities, but no further record of the item exists. By the mid-1890s, the sisters had become legend. Every few years, new rumors surfaced, sightings in Guthrie or Enid, or across the border in Arkansas. One persistent tale claimed that two women fitting their description had worked briefly as nurses in a cholera ward near Fort Smith before vanishing after a patient's sudden death. No proof was ever found. Yet even amid myth, a tangible unease remained around Dry Fork Creek. Travelers spoke of strange fogs that rose only at night, drifting low over the ground where the saloon once stood. Hunters swore that when they camped nearby, their campfires sputtered without wind. When Harrow published his article in 1892, he ended with a line that still chills historians who quote it today. "The territory has turned its soil and its soul inside out for progress, but some stains will not lift." After his death in 1895, his papers were boxed and stored in a courthouse basement, forgotten until rediscovered decades later. By then, the land had been sold, divided, and renamed. But the legend endured, carried in whispers by descendants of settlers and in the archival margins of those who dared to document what the earth refused to forget. 1881 Oklahoma Territory, Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles. By the spring of 1893, the land rush had transformed much of the Oklahoma Territory into a patchwork of farms and townships. The region once known as the unassigned lands was no longer an undefined frontier, but a mosaic of new claims and bustling optimism. Still, even as settlers plowed the soil and built their homes, many avoided the tract of ground along Dry Fork Creek. The area was said to be cursed ground, a phrase repeated in letters and even noted on one county survey map, where a hand-drawn skull marked the old saloon's location. When questioned about it years later, the cartographer reportedly laughed and said, "It wasn't me that marked it. It was one of the local boys. But I didn't erase it either." That same year, a group of railroad workers grading a nearby section unearthed a row of charred timbers and what appeared to be the outline of a foundation. Beneath the boards, they discovered a rusted hinge and a single glass stopper. One worker, Hank Tully, pocketed the stopper as a curiosity. 2 days later, he was hospitalized after sudden, unexplained convulsions. The doctor at the time called it a fit brought on by exhaustion, though Tully's co-workers swore he'd been healthy that morning. The incident reignited local gossip. Some began to claim the Hartley sisters' saloon had been built atop an older trading post, one with its own history of violence and theft dating back to the 1850s. No record confirms this, but the rumor conveniently deepened the story's dread. In 1894, a schoolteacher named Ellen Porter, who had moved into the area from Missouri, wrote an essay for a small literary publication titled Ghosts of the Creek. It combined folklore with fact, weaving the wicked saloon tale into a meditation on guilt and memory. She cited Harrow's 1892 article and, notably, mentioned the unassigned land's history, suggesting that such tales arise where law and faith have yet to catch up with ambition. Her words struck a chord. By the decade's end, the story of the Hartley sisters had achieved near-mythic status. Preachers referenced it in sermons, warning of the wages of deceit. Bar owners in Guthrie and Oklahoma City kept bottles labeled Hartley's Reserve as novelty decor, replicas filled with dyed water and corked wax sold to tourists for a dime. Yet beneath the commercial curiosity, unease persisted among locals. Late-night travelers still reported strange lights near the creek, small flickering glows that vanished when approached. In 1896, a prospector claimed to have seen two figures standing by the riverbank, motionless and staring into the water. When he called out, they turned together and disappeared into the fog. Even official records couldn't ignore the story's endurance. A brief entry in the Oklahoma Territorial Gazetteer of 1898 included a note under defunct settlements: Dry Fork Crossing, abandoned 1884. Site of rumored criminal activity. Local superstition persists. By the dawn of the new century, the Hartley legend had passed fully into the realm of frontier folklore. Yet every few years, the earth itself seemed to remember, uncovering a shard, a bone, or a bottle, as if unwilling to let the story end. 1881 Oklahoma Territory. Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the Bloodied bottles. At the turn of the 20th century, Oklahoma Territory stood on the threshold of statehood. Progress was swift. Railroads, telegraph lines, and new towns stitched the once isolated lands together. Yet in old farmsteads and taverns, one story refused to fade. It lingered not in official histories, but in the pauses between conversations. The whispered name Hartley. In 1901, a university lecturer from Kansas named Dr. Silas Moreau traveled through the region while collecting folklore for a forthcoming book on frontier superstitions. His field notes, later housed at the University of Oklahoma, included 3 separate accounts of what locals called the Sisters' Curse. One entry read, "The older folk tell that at Dry Fork, no crop will grow where the saloon's floor once lay. The ground rejects seed. The air smells of spirits and rain, even in drought." Dr. Moreau interviewed several aging residents, including Mrs. Ada Connolly, the midwife who had once sold laudanum to the sisters 20 years earlier. Her recollections, though halting, were chilling. They were polite. Too polite. I thought them lonely women, but when they spoke, their words came out rehearsed, like reading from a script they'd written for survival. Moreau's notes mentioned that Mrs. Connolly still kept an object from that time, a small, silver spoon engraved with LH. When he asked to photograph it, she refused, saying, "Some things best not be remembered too clearly." Halfway through his research, Moreau referenced contemporary territorial history, noting the chaotic atmosphere described in records of the Ewe, unassigned lands. He suggested that the uncertainty of property rights and law enforcement during that period might have shielded figures, like the Hartley sisters, whose quiet cunning allowed them to vanish into an unsettled landscape. Later that same year, while camping near the old Dry Fork site, Moreau reported hearing a faint rhythmic sound of glass striking glass. His students laughed it off as wind rattling debris. But his journal's closing entry for that night was less certain. The moon was low, the water still. "Yet I heard it." 12 chimes, soft, hollow, then silence. I do not believe it was the wind. When Moreau's book Frontier Echoes and the Human Imagination was published in 1903, one chapter was dedicated to the Wicked Saloon. He concluded that the tale represented the collision between untamed ambition and the fragile conscience of settlement. Readers found it hauntingly persuasive, and for a time it revived public interest in the case. This new wave of fascination led amateur historians to re-examine court records and military correspondence from Fort Reno, searching for overlooked clues. Among the recovered documents was a torn note, possibly part of Latham's original report, bearing only a few legible words. 2 women disappeared before dawn, left behind the red glass. The meaning was uncertain, but it reignited debate. Were the sisters victims of mob justice, or had they fled and continued their crimes elsewhere? By 1905, land developers planned to repurpose the old Dry Fork area for farmland. When crews began clearing the brush, their plows struck something hard beneath the soil. Rows of broken bottles, arranged in careful lines, their wax seals melted away by age. Workers reported that the soil around the bottles was darker and denser than the rest. One foreman ordered them gathered and dumped in the creek, muttering, "Let the past sink where it belongs." But as night fell, the workers swore the creek began to glow faintly, as if reflecting a fire that wasn't there. 1881 Oklahoma Territory. Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the Bloodied bottles. By 1906, Preparations for Oklahoma's transition to statehood were well underway. Yet the newly plowed farmlands of Dry Fork Creek still resisted cultivation. The farmers who tried to settle there noted how the soil turned sour. Corn withered early, and wells produced water with a faint metallic taste. One of these farmers, Henry Lasker, kept a journal later discovered by his grandson in the 1940s. In an entry dated April 19, 1906, Lasker wrote, "There's something not right in this ground. Found glass while digging a fence post, green and red, half buried. The oxen won't go near the east field anymore. At night the creek smells of burnt wood and old whiskey." He wasn't alone in his unease. Nearby homesteaders spoke of the same strange resistance from the land. They said it remembered too much. An old post rider who'd once delivered mail through Dry Fork in the 1880s told Lasker, "That place had death poured into it. You can't plow away ghosts." Around this time, Oklahoma newspapers, hungry for stories of the frontier's darker side, began reprinting fragments of Clifton Harrow's earlier 1892 article, The Blood at Dry Fork. Some included sidebars summarizing the official history of the unassigned lands, emphasizing how its lawlessness made crimes like the Hartley murders possible. The editors always paraphrased the same chilling point, that before fences, before maps, evil could disappear between survey lines. In July 1906, a local doctor named James Cotter visited the Lasker homestead after the farmer's wife fell mysteriously ill. She complained of nausea and vivid dreams, visions of a cellar filled with bottles that whispered. Cotter examined her and noted an unusual rash across her hands, as if caused by mild chemical burns. When he asked whether she had handled anything unusual, she admitted to cleaning old glass jars from the field. Cotter collected one of the fragments, a thick piece of red glass with wax residue, and sent it to a laboratory in Guthrie. The results were never officially published, but an excerpt survives in a letter he sent to a colleague. Traces of arsenic and an unidentified organic compound present, possibly remnants of homemade tinctures or tonics. Yet the binding agent seems unnatural, neither resin nor gum. Cotter's letter ended abruptly with the note, "We'll investigate further after the harvest." No follow-up was ever found. The Laskers left the property the next year, moving north toward Kingfisher County. Their abandoned cabin was later dismantled for timber, but neighbors claimed that one of the workmen who tore down the fireplace found behind a loose brick a small corked vial. Inside was cloudy liquid and a scrap of cloth embroidered with the initials MH. By now, nearly 25 years had passed since the Hartley sisters disappeared, yet their presence persisted in physical traces, as if the land itself had become a kind of archive. Local folklore began to merge with new superstitions. Farmers hung bottles upside down along fences to ward off the sisters' eyes, a practice said to keep spirits from crossing property lines. Even local school children knew the rhyme by then. "Don't drink deep at Dry Fork Creek, the sisters pour what death will keep." It was sung softly, mostly at dusk, passed from one generation to the next. 1881 Oklahoma Territory, Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the Bloodied bottles. By the time Oklahoma officially achieved statehood in 1907, the Wicked Saloon had already passed into the realm of near myth. Yet among historians and amateur antiquarians, the story continued to attract quiet fascination. The shift from oral folklore to written record had begun, and with it, new questions arose about what really happened in that lost corner of the territory. One of the earliest attempts to piece the case together came from Professor Edwin Harcourt, a historian at the fledgling University of Oklahoma. In 1908, Harcourt published a short paper titled Unsettled Crimes of the Unassigned Lands. It referenced the Dry Fork incident briefly, citing surviving fragments from Deputy Latham's correspondence and Clifton Harrow's investigative notes. Though Harcourt maintained an academic tone, his description was haunting. The soil at Dry Fork Creek contains more than the trace of human error. It bears the residue of a moral corrosion peculiar to frontier life, where the bottle and the blade often perform the same purpose. Harcourt compared the mystery to other frontier crimes in neighboring territories, but admitted that none displayed such an enduring aftertaste of dread. He even mentioned the unassigned land's history as a backdrop for understanding the conditions that made such cases possible, those lawless pockets where official memory falters and private wickedness thrives. Not everyone agreed with his conclusions. A territorial archivist named Ruth Delaney criticized his paper in a regional review, claiming that too much of Harcourt's account relies on second-hand rumor rather than authenticated records. Yet, ironically, her own footnotes confirmed the disappearance of multiple property claims tied to the Hartley name, entries mysteriously crossed out in the 1880s land registries. That same year, a new family attempted to farm the area again. The Colsons, a couple from Arkansas, built a modest home beside the creek, determined to disprove the superstitions. For several months they prospered, but by winter the husband fell ill with tremors and hallucinations. In one of his final entries before he was taken to the territorial infirmary, Thomas Colson scrawled a few words in his weather journal: "Voices from under the floor." 2 women whispering, asking for names. His wife, Martha, later insisted that it was only fever delirium. Yet she burned the house to its foundation before leaving, saying it was better that way. Around the same period, a group of local boys exploring the creek found an old iron key ring buried in the silt. Attached to it was a brass tag stamped H&Co. They sold it to a traveling trader for a handful of coins. Decades later, it surfaced again in a collector's inventory labeled Artifact from Wicked Saloon Site, 1881-1883. As the state entered the new century, newspapers grew nostalgic for frontier tales, and the Hartley sisters' story was retold in serialized fashion, each writer adding new flourishes, each generation softening the edges of horror into cautionary legend. But scholars noted a strange consistency. The laughter, the bottles, the smell of iron and whiskey, these details remained unchanged, as though some deep current of truth persisted beneath the embellishment. In 1910, Harcourt revisited the subject during a public lecture in Guthrie. He concluded with a remark that would outlive him. "History will not confess what the land itself already has. Some sins never learned how to die." The audience, composed of new citizens eager to shed the ghost of the frontier, sat silent. Outside, the wind from the plains carried faint echoes of glass clinking together, perhaps only the sound of wagons in the distance, or perhaps something older, unwilling to rest. 1881, Oklahoma Territory, Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles. By 1911, Guthrie had replaced the dusty frontier camps with libraries, courthouses, and paved streets. Yet curiosity about the territory's darker corners still thrived among scholars and storytellers. Within that year, the Oklahoma Historical Society initiated a small project to collect first-hand accounts of the early settlement era, inviting surviving pioneers to contribute letters and recollections. Among the dozens received was one unsigned document labeled simply, "From a woman who remembers the sisters." It was written in careful, flowing script, folded into 3 parts, and postmarked from Enid. The letter described 2 women arriving at a small settlement in 1882, one with a hand scarred from burns, the other quick with words but slow to meet the eye. The author recalled how the pair rented a cabin and sold homemade spirits that tasted too clean, like something meant to hide a bitter core. In her closing paragraph, the anonymous writer confessed, "I drank their brew only once and I could not sleep for 3 nights. I dreamt of bottles buried in rows beneath my feet and awoke to find soil under my nails." The Historical Society archivists debated its authenticity, but Professor Harcourt, who was consulted again, pointed out that such handwriting and phrasing were consistent with 1880s correspondence from that region. He included a paraphrase of this letter in his next essay, calling it a reminder that the line between history and haunting is often drawn by those who survive to tell it. By this time, the old unassigned lands had become a fully mapped and regulated part of the state, yet the area surrounding Dry Fork Creek remained largely undeveloped. Locals avoided buying parcels there, citing poor drainage and bad air. One county assessor even wrote in his margin notes, "Ground still gives off foul odor after heavy rain, may contain refuse from early homesteads." That autumn, a group of geology students from the university visited the site for soil analysis. Their report, dry, technical, and precise, recorded high concentrations of iron and sulfur near the creek, with organic traces inconsistent with normal agricultural runoff. One of the students, Jacob Lively, noted in his personal log, found fragments of glass again embedded deep, dark stains on underside. Locals warned us not to touch them. When the students returned to campus, Lively began experiencing vivid nightmares of water seeping under his dormitory door, carrying with it the faint smell of spirits. He withdrew from the university weeks later. His classmates called it exhaustion, though one recalled him muttering before he left, "They're still there. I heard them in the creek." Meanwhile, local folklore continued to evolve. A traveling preacher named Reverend Tobias Wren incorporated the Wicked Saloon into his revival sermons as a warning against female vice and ungodly ambition. His dramatic retellings, complete with props of red-stained bottles, attracted large crowds. Though he claimed moral purpose, newspapers mocked his showmanship, calling him the Bottle Reverend. Still, in the midst of show and superstition, the story found its way into textbooks and lectures as a case study of early Oklahoma myth-making. Writers often cited the unassigned lands reference to frame the chaos that allowed the Hartley sisters to disappear without record, a disappearance that mirrored the moral uncertainty of the time itself. But in private circles, among historians and archivists, a different whisper circulated, that somewhere beneath the new farmland and fences, part of the Hartley's original cellar might still remain intact, uncollapsed, undisturbed, and if that were true, perhaps the land had not yet told all it remembered. 1881, Oklahoma Territory, Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles. In the winter of 1912, the Territory's ghost stories found new life when a regional periodical, the Frontier Review, published a serialized column titled Echoes Beneath the Prairie. One installment revisited the Wicked Saloon of Dry Fork, drawing upon Professor Harcourt's essays and the records archived at the Oklahoma Historical Society. The article opened with a chilling line, "The earth is an honest witness, it forgets nothing, even when men do." The author, Eleanor Fitch, was a young researcher, and among the few women working in the state archives at that time. Her meticulous writing blended historical precision with an almost investigative curiosity. She reviewed early property claims, census gaps, and the fragmented ledgers attributed to Hartley and Cota, the sisters' supposed enterprise. Fitch noted that several names listed in those ledgers corresponded to men who later vanished from territorial employment records, suggesting that the sisters may have systematically targeted transients unlikely to be missed. She also cited the unassigned land's background to explain the conditions under which such crimes could occur. When law exists only on paper, and borders shift like wind-blown lines, guilt is a thing that can simply walk away. Her words, paraphrased from the same source historians often use to describe early Oklahoma governance, carried an eerie weight. Fitch's article gained considerable attention, sparking correspondence from readers who claimed to possess family relics or knowledge of the sisters. One letter, published in the March 1913 issue, came from an elderly farmer near Weatherford who insisted he'd once found a brass locket inscribed L.H. buried in his wheat field. He kept it for years, until one morning it had turned black as if tarnished overnight by smoke. Another correspondent from Norman described a childhood memory of her father, a former railroad inspector, who refused to stop near Dry Fork even in daylight, saying, "There's something in that ground that still remembers blood." As more stories poured in, Fitch decided to visit the site herself in April 1913. Her field notebook, preserved in the archives, recorded weather conditions, soil composition, and sketches of the terrain. On the final page, written in faint pencil, she noted, "Unearthed 2 glass fragments near old creek bed, thick, red tint, soil around them slightly oily, heard movement in brush, possibly an animal, still felt watched." She returned to Guthrie the next day and submitted her report. Months later, during an academic lecture, she described the experience as unsettling but necessary, insisting that folklore was just history with its hands still. "Dirty," her closing remark during that lecture, mirrored her article's earlier tone. If these stories persist, it's because the land itself insists on remembering. The Wicked Saloon was not simply a building. It was a symptom, born from a borderless world where law and loss shared the same foundation. The remark cemented Fitch's reputation among historians, but drew ire from moral reformers, who accused her of glorifying sin. Nonetheless, her research became the definitive source for all later retellings of the Hartley case. In later correspondence to the Historical Society, she mentioned planning another trip to Dry Fork before the year's end. Her final surviving letter, dated October 14, 1913, ended with a curious postscript. "Someone has been here before me. The soil looks freshly turned again. The bottles, I think, are not all gone." 1881. Oklahoma Territory, Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles. When Eleanor Fitch failed to appear for her next scheduled lecture in November 1913, her colleagues assumed she had taken ill. But after several days without word, the university dispatched a local sheriff to her boarding house in Guthrie. The room was undisturbed, her traveling bag neatly packed, her coat folded at the foot of the bed. Only her field journal was missing. The last known record of Fitch comes from a witness statement by a livery stable hand, who claimed she'd rented a horse 2 days earlier. Headed west, said she wanted to ride by Dry Fork one last time before the frost. Neither she nor the horse were ever found. The sheriff's search uncovered nothing. No tracks, no belongings. Only a set of faint hoof prints leading toward the creek and ending at the water's edge. The next morning the creek overflowed from heavy rain, erasing the trail completely. Her disappearance made headlines across the territory. The Guthrie Herald ran a front-page story titled, "Archivist Lost in Haunted Valley." The tone bordered on sensational, yet it revived public interest in the Hartley sisters once again. People speculated that Fitch had stumbled upon something the land had long hidden, perhaps even the sisters' final resting place. In her absence, the Historical Society published her earlier findings posthumously the following year. The article "Remnants at Dry Fork" became her legacy. In it, Fitch paraphrased portions of the unassigned land's reference for context, writing, "During the years when no law held sway between Fort Reno and Purcell, the land itself was ungoverned, its silence as permissive as any decree. It is within such silence that deeds like these are born." Her measured words carried a quiet condemnation of the moral vacuum that frontier expansion had created. For decades afterward, her article remained the most cited source on the Wicked Saloon. Meanwhile, locals who lived near the old site reported unsettling events during that same winter. Hunters swore that after the rains, parts of the creek bank had caved in, revealing what looked like wooden beams, possibly the remains of the old saloon cellar. One man, Franklin Dyer, grandson of the vanished drover Amos Dyer, claimed he went to investigate. In an interview given years later, he described what he saw. "There was a hole in the ground, black and wet. I shined my lantern in. The light caught glass, rows of it like bottles laid to rest. I called out, but the sound just died in the air. He sealed the hole with stones and crossed himself before leaving. When he returned a week later, the creek had risen again, swallowing everything beneath murky water." After Fitch's disappearance, superstition grew stronger. Locals began leaving offerings by the creek, small coins, sprigs of sage, or old bottles filled with river water, an odd ritual meant to appease restless spirits. Ministers decried the practice as pagan nonsense, yet even they avoided holding services too near the site. By 1915, when Oklahoma's farmlands were fully developed and the last vestiges of the old territory faded from living memory, Dry Fork Creek remained untouched. Roads curved away from it. Surveyors skipped its name entirely. A newspaper editor in Enid, summarizing the story in an anniversary column, wrote succinctly, "The Wicked Saloon stands only in stories now. But they say the creek still whispers after dark, bottles knocking together like teeth, reminding those who listen that not all ghosts wear white." And so once again, the legend slipped beneath the surface of history, half documented, half dreaded, waiting for time to disturb the soil once more. 1881 Oklahoma Territory, Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles. As the First World War loomed in Europe and Oklahoma's small towns hummed with new industry, the story of the Hartley sisters faded into a faint cultural murmur. Yet history, as it so often does, has a way of circling back. In 1916, construction crews working to expand a railway spur between El Reno and Weatherford uncovered what they believed to be remnants of an old structure near the banks of Dry Fork Creek, according to the work foreman's report, later filed in the county's development records. They found foundation stones, a rusted stove, and fragments of charred wood that gave off a faintly sweet odor when struck with the shovel. One laborer, a man named Benton Price, recalled, "The smell hit like whiskey gone bad, thick and cloying, like it had been waiting down there a long while." While most of the debris was hauled away, a few workers pocketed souvenirs, bits of metal, glass, and wood. Within a week, 2 of them fell sick with a fever that the camp doctor couldn't identify. The incident was brushed off as coincidence, yet rumors spread quickly. Soon, workers refused to return to that stretch of land after sundown. An engineer on the project, Robert Field, kept a private log of each discovery. His notes, found decades later, mention a partially collapsed cellar unearthed near the creek's bend. Inside were several corks, an iron tap handle, and one intact bottle, its wax still sealed. Field sent it to Guthrie for chemical analysis, but the sample was lost en route. Only a receipt remained, stamped by a courier who later claimed the package leaked through the crate. Meanwhile, newspapers began to stir again. The El Reno Daily Globe ran a piece headlined, "Wicked Saloon Unearthed," summarizing the find and referencing prior accounts of the unassigned lands period. The journalist, clearly paraphrasing the historical record, wrote, "In those days before law and title, many enterprises thrived unseen. The Sisters of Dry Fork operated within that silence, and it seems the earth now exhumes their memory." For a brief moment, curiosity rekindled. Locals gathered at the site to watch the excavations. Some brought bottles of their own, mostly empty, some filled with creek water, to leave behind as quiet tributes. It was said that one night, as the workers cleared the last stones, a distant laugh carried across the prairie, faint yet distinct. The foreman, a practical man, dismissed it as coyotes, but others swore it was 2 voices. The following spring, the railway rerouted its line 2 miles north after engineers reported unstable ground and persistent seepage. No more digging was done at Dry Fork Creek. The cellar, once again, was left to fill with silt and water. Over time, the site slipped from memory. Only a few older residents remembered the events at all, and even they spoke of it cautiously, as if saying too much might invite it back. By 1917, the last direct reference to the Wicked Saloon appeared in a local church pamphlet warning of unholy enterprises and women without repentance. Beneath the sermon's text was a simple illustration. 2 bottles drawn side by side, their corks bleeding ink into the page. After that, silence returned. The land settled. The air cleared, but not entirely. Those who walked the creek after midnight claimed that the wind carried faint music, a tune like glass chimes swaying on a soundless current. When they followed it, they always found themselves standing at the same place, the old saloon's foundation, now nothing more than a depression in the earth, cold even under summer moonlight. 1881, Oklahoma Territory. Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles. By 1918, Oklahoma was sending young men overseas, and the old legends of its frontier past seemed almost quaint in comparison to the headlines of war. Yet for those who remained behind, particularly in the quiet farming counties west of El Reno, stories of Dry Fork Creek still traveled by word of mouth. A schoolteacher named Margaret Lowe, who had taken an interest in state folklore, began interviewing elderly residents for a local history booklet. Among her notes, preserved in the state archives decades later, was a remarkable entry from an interview with Franklin Dyer, the same man who had once seen the bottles beneath the creek bed. He was now gray-haired, stooped and cautious with his words. "I've seen things I can't rightly say aloud," Dyer told her. "Some nights when the fog rolls low, I hear the creek breathing. I know that sounds foolish, but there's rhythm to it, like someone shifting crates below the water." When Lowe asked why he thought the land felt restless, he replied, "Because they never left. Not the sisters, nor the ones who drank there. The dirt holds memory like the barrel holds whiskey, tight and deep." Her write-up of that interview later appeared in a local journal under the title, "The Voices of Dry Fork." Though modest in circulation, the piece rekindled scholarly curiosity. A few young researchers at the University of Oklahoma, perhaps inspired by Fitch's earlier disappearance, proposed a small expedition to locate any remaining traces of the saloon's cellar. In 1919, under the guidance of Professor Albert Hensley, 3 students spent a week near the creek using rudimentary survey tools and shovels. Their field log recorded only minor findings: brick shards, scorched timber, and a rusted iron tap. But one student, Daniel Pruitt, included a peculiar detail in his personal journal. The air near the waterline feels wrong, heavy still. Heard faint laughter last night. 2 voices close, but the fire didn't throw shadows. When Hensley presented their report to the university's history department, he referenced the unassigned lands record to provide context for why the sisters' activities had gone uninvestigated. His tone was dry, academic. These remnants serve as physical testimony to the gaps in early territorial governance, where criminal acts could dissolve as easily as smoke. The report was never published, but it circulated quietly among colleagues. Some dismissed it as a curiosity. Others were uneasy with its implications. Hensley's assistant later remarked that the professor seemed deeply unsettled after their return. He stopped lecturing on Oklahoma history altogether, choosing instead to teach European politics until his retirement. Meanwhile, rumors persisted. Children growing up in nearby farms were warned never to fetch water after dark. Hunters spoke of seeing lantern light bobbing along the creek, even when no one else was near. And occasionally, travelers would mention a faint smell, smoke and something sweet drifting across the fields just before dawn. That autumn, a violent storm struck the region. Floodwaters tore through the creek bed, carving new channels and burying the old depression beneath silt. When the rains ended, the site had changed completely, flattened, featureless, unremarkable. It seemed at last that the wicked saloon had been erased for good. But erasure is never the same as forgetting. In a small footnote within Hensley's correspondence, discovered years later by archivists, he mentioned one final, haunting observation. The soil there holds a glint when the sun hits it just right. Not gold, not mica, something else. Something red. 1881, Oklahoma Territory. Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles. The floods of 1919 changed more than the landscape. They erased the last visible traces of Dry Fork Crossing from all but memory. When new settlers moved in the following spring, they built their fences without realizing what lay beneath. But the land, as always, remembered. By 1920, Oklahoma had fully stepped into the modern age. Automobiles replaced wagons, and electricity reached towns that once lived only by lamplight. Yet amid all that progress, a few old-timers continued to tell the story of the Hartley sisters, quietly, as though repeating it too loudly might draw their attention. One such man, Henry McCall, owned a small feed store in Kingfisher County. In the summer of 1920, he told a traveling reporter from the Southwest Chronicle that he'd recently met a woman matching the description of Louisa Hartley. According to McCall, she was in her 60s, thin with a long scar on her left hand, and spoke with a faint northern accent. She purchased grain sacks, not liquor, but before leaving she asked if the road to Dry Fork was still open. The reporter dismissed the story as the ramblings of an old man. Yet when he checked the rail ledger, he found that the same day, a woman had indeed boarded a freight car eastbound from Kingfisher under the name L. Howell, the same alias once linked to the sisters decades earlier. After that, there were no further sightings. It might have ended there, but that autumn, a group of field hands clearing brush near the former creek bed uncovered something strange, a metal latch fused to stone, and below it, a faint, hollow space. The men hesitated to dig further, remembering the local legend. They pried loose a single plank and found beneath it nothing but cold air and darkness. The foreman, uneasy, ordered the hole sealed. "We're not paid to wake the past," he said. A few nights later, one of the workers claimed to have dreamt of a barroom lit by red lanterns. He described hearing 2 women laughing softly while pouring drinks. When he awoke, his hands smelled of smoke and whiskey. He quit the next morning and never returned. That winter, a local newspaper printed a small retrospective titled "Haunted Creeks of the Frontier." The piece summarized several territorial legends, but Dry Fork earned a full column. The writer, clearly familiar with the earlier unassigned lands account, remarked that the Hartley case illustrated the moral frontier as much as the geographic one. He paraphrased one of Fitch's surviving notes, writing, "In places where the law could not reach, memory became the only witness, and even that can be bribed by time. By then, nearly 40 years had passed since the first bottle had been unearthed near the Saloon. Yet still the same elements endured: glass, laughter, and the stubborn refusal of the earth to let go. The article closed with a curious detail. The writer claimed that after his visit to the area, he'd collected a small shard of red glass as a keepsake. 2 weeks later, the shard had turned dark, opaque, and warm to the touch, as though something inside it was trying to breathe. He returned it to the creek. Locals said the following morning, the water ran red for an hour before turning clear again. 1881, Oklahoma Territory, Wicked Saloon, the sisters behind the bloodied bottles. By the early 1920s, Dry Fork Creek no longer appeared on maps. Roads bypassed it, rail lines curved away, and the once notorious stretch of land settled into quiet anonymity. Yet for those who knew its history, the silence never felt entirely peaceful. A generation raised on stories of the Wicked Saloon treated the place with wary respect. Hunters left offerings, coins, herbs, or bits of glass along the banks before setting traps. Children dared one another to walk the creek's edge after sundown, though few ever did. And on rare nights when the wind blew low and the field smelled faintly of whiskey, the old folks would close their doors early and light a candle on the windowsill to keep the sisters away. Around 1922, a young historian named Clara Renshaw, a student of Professor Harcourt's surviving notes, attempted to compile a definitive account of the Hartley case. Her manuscript, The Spirits of Dry Fork, was never formally published, but drafts preserved in the archives show her methodical effort to trace every name, date, and rumor. She cited the unassigned lands reference for its description of the lawless gap that had once allowed people, and their crimes, to disappear entirely from official record. She also paraphrased Eleanor Fitch's lost journals, noting that memory clings most tightly where the land was never meant to forget. In her final chapter, Renshaw included interviews with settlers who'd inherited farms on the former site. One man, John Colson, the son of the couple who had burned their house years earlier, described how plows still struck glass every spring. He said the pieces were too deep to have been discarded by any farmer, and that when the sun caught them, they gleamed like red mirrors. Sometimes, he told her, I think they buried their sins in bottles so they'd never have to hear them break. Renshaw's field notes mention finding one such fragment herself, embedded in the roots of an elm. She described it as smooth and warm to the touch. Even in winter, she returned it to the ground before leaving, adding a small line at the bottom of her notes. It's better to let the creek keep what it has claimed. And so the legend endured, not through monuments or markers, but through whispers that refused to fade. The Wicked Saloon became a ghost story for the new century, its roots tangled in both truth and soil. Even modern surveys conducted decades later reported faint chemical traces in the groundwater. Nothing harmful, merely strange, as if the land itself still distilled its own memories. No definitive evidence of the Hartley sisters was ever found. No grave, no photograph, no confession. Only the recurring echoes, laughter in the wind, the clink of glass beneath the earth, the faint scent of whiskey after rain. And though the frontier has long since vanished, those who camp near the site say that when night falls quiet and the water runs low, the creek still murmurs softly, as if retelling its story to anyone willing to listen. They say the bottles are still there, sealed beneath the soil, waiting,